December 20th, 1943. A frozen night over the North Sea. The sky is a vast, moonless void, broken only by the faint glow of exhaust flames drifting behind German night fighters returning from an interception sweep. Deep inside a Luftwaffe radar bunker near the Dutch coast, the air is thick with cigarette smoke, warm equipment hum, and the nervous tension that has become routine after years of war. Suddenly, a faint pulse appears on the operator's screen, a blip where nothing should be. It moves smoothly, steadily, completely unaffected by the ground-based search beams sweeping the sky. The duty officer steps closer, narrowing his eyes. The frequency is unfamiliar, the altitude unusual, the precision unnerving. Moments later, a second signal appears, then a third, all at exact intervals, all approaching targets with a confidence that suggests they can see in the dark. The officer feels a cold weight settle in his throat. These aren't German aircraft. These are American bombers, finding their way through pitch-black skies, through cloud layers, through every blind spot Germany once relied on for safety. And on this night, German command begins to understand the Americans are no longer flying blind. Their radars are airborne. Long before radar screens glowed inside darkened bunkers, the night sky over Europe had been a realm of chance. Pilots depended on moonlight, city fires, and intuition. Anti-aircraft crews listened for engine echoes across rooftops. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, star lines, and luck. In the first years of the war, both sides flew largely blind after sunset. But Germany, entering the conflict in 1939, was ahead of the world in radio detection. Systems such as Freya, with its early warning capabilities, and Würzburg, with its refined tracking beams, formed a defensive web along the coasts of occupied Europe. These ground-based radars gave the Luftwaffe an early and formidable advantage. They could spot incoming bombers, direct night fighters into intercept positions, and shield industrial zones deep inside the Reich. The early Allied air raids struggled against this network. British bombers, flying without onboard radar, often scattered or became lost in cloud layers. Navigation errors caused aircraft to miss their targets by miles. What Germany feared least in 1940 and 1941 was a night attack that could accurately penetrate their radar-guided defenses. For German officers, the logic seemed solid. If the enemy depended entirely on ground signals and celestial navigation, Germany could predict their routes, control the response, and intercept with precision. But the situation began to change when the British introduced a breakthrough, airborne interception, AI radar, allowing night fighters to detect enemy bombers from the air. It was primitive at first, heavy, unstable, and easily jammed. Still, it represented a dangerous shift. Not all detection would come from the ground. American observers studied this intensely. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they brought industrial capacity unmatched by any European nation. Factories that once built cars, radios, and refrigerators converted into research hubs and military assembly lines. Thousands of physicists, mathematicians, and engineers, some American-born, some refugees from Europe, were tasked with a single mission: give U.S. forces visibility in the sky, where darkness had always reigned. By early 1942, the U.S. Signal Corps and MIT Radiation Laboratory were designing airborne radars specifically for long-range navigation and bombing. Unlike British AI systems meant for air combat, American radar was intended to guide entire bomber formations across hostile territory, regardless of weather. This shift marked the beginning of a technological race Germany could not fully comprehend. American radars were evolving faster than German intelligence could track, and each new device reduced the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe's meticulously built defenses. Meanwhile, the United States Army Air Forces were preparing for deep penetration raids, day and night, against Germany's industrial heartland. But American doctrine relied on precision. Their bombing strategies required visibility to hit factories, rail networks, and oil plants with accuracy. Clouds, fog, winter storms, and smoke screens had been Germany's most reliable protection. The Luftwaffe believed nature itself would shield the Reich from many of America's attacks. But with radar in the air, nature no longer offered any sanctuary. The first operational tests of American airborne radar in late 1942 stunned even seasoned commander. Bombers could identify coastlines through thick clouds. They could fix their position without visual reference. And most critically, they could guide entire formations to a target even when the ground was invisible. This alone threatened the core assumption of German defensive strategy. The Luftwaffe command did not yet know the scale of what was coming. They intercepted scattered intelligence about flying microwave antennas, blind bombing devices, and high-frequency beacons carried on bombers. But the details were vague. Reports were inconsistent. Some officers dismissed them as exaggerations. Others, especially those directing night fighters, were deeply concerned. Because if the Americans could truly see in the dark, Germany's ground-based radar grid would lose its dominance. Its defensive plans would unravel, and its night fighters would become hunters without control of the hunt. By the winter of 1942-43, this fear was already beginning to grow, and it would soon explode when German officers realized the Americans weren't just experimenting. They were deploying airborne radar into combat. By mid-1943, American involvement in the air war over Europe had transformed from cautious testing to relentless operational demand. The 8th Air Force, operating from airfields scattered across England, was preparing for deep strikes into the German Reich. But these missions faced a growing challenge. Weather. The North Atlantic and Western European climate created persistent layers of cloud, fog, and winter storms. Visual bombing, central to U.S. doctrine, became nearly impossible for weeks at a time. Entire raids had to be aborted. Precious fuel was wasted. Targets remained untouched, and German industry continued to function. Commanders needed a solution that did not depend on clear skies. The answer came in the form of a new, compact, high-frequency radar system. The H-2X Mickey derived from British H-2S but redesigned with American engineering and manufacturing capability. Unlike German radars, which were optimized for tracking aircraft, H-2X used downward-facing microwave pulses to map the ground beneath the bomber, even through dense cloud layers. Cities, coastlines, rivers, rail yards, and industrial zones appeared as glowing shapes on the operator's circular screen. Not perfectly detailed, but detailed enough to bomb. Alongside H-2X came other airborne radars, SCR-520 and SCR-720 for night fighter interception, AN-APS-3 and APS-4 for maritime patrol and anti-shipping, AN-APQ-13 for long-range navigation in the Pacific. Improved H-2X variants specialized for strategic bombing. Each system solved a different operational problem, but together they created something no Air Force had ever possessed before: a technologically unified airborne network of detection, navigation, and attack. This network broke the traditional limitations imposed by weather and darkness. For German officers, accustomed to predictable Allied patterns, the implications were catastrophic. Ground fog over Dortmund no longer guaranteed safety. Winter storms over Berlin no longer disrupted missions. Smoke screens laid over the Ruhr no longer hid critical factories from American bombers. Bombing patterns that once relied on moonlit nights and clear visibility now occurred in complete invisibility. German observers began noticing an alarming trend. Allied bomber formations were appearing over targets, despite conditions in which navigation should have been impossible. At first, German intelligence attributed this to improved training or scattered beacons on the ground. But by late 1943, they captured fragments of radar components from crashed American aircraft. Technical officers studying them were stunned by the frequencies used, the precision of the cavity magnetrons, and the compact size of the devices. What they held was not an incremental improvement. It was a complete leap ahead. The Luftwaffe's own airborne radar development, the Liechtenstein series, was functional but outdated. It relied on longer wavelengths, bulkier antennas, and lower resolution. Worse, American and British jammers were increasingly effective against it. While Germany struggled to refine a technology strained by wartime shortages, the Allies mass-produced advanced systems at a pace impossible for the Nazi war economy to match. By the start of 1944, German officers at the Reichsluftfahrtministerium began receiving reports describing radar-aimed American bombing. They noted patterns: bombers hitting targets hidden beneath cloud, night fighters losing track of intruders, U-boat pens being struck from altitudes too high for visual aim, weather no longer altering mission schedules. What had once been anomalies were now unmistakable trends. The Americans were using airborne radar systematically and effectively. This realization created a rising sense of dread within Luftwaffe leadership, not just because their defenses were being penetrated, but because they understood that technology of this scale and deployed in such quantity signified something deeper. Germany could no longer compete in the technological race. Every day that passed, the gap widened. Every new radar installed in a B-17 or B-24 widened it further. Every American bomber group trained on H-2X made German ground-based radar less relevant. By early 1944, one fact was becoming clear. The Americans had brought the radar war into the sky, and the Luftwaffe had no answer waiting. From this growing imbalance would emerge the first true wave of fear. Fear that would grip German commanders as they realized the kind of precision the Americans could unleash. And that growing fear sets the stage for the deeper angles that shaped this turning point. But even after the war was over, the story didn't simply close. Many of these Japanese women officers carried a silent burden for the rest of their lives. Not because they were treated harshly, but because they were treated humanely, in a world where they expected only hostility. For years, some of them refused to speak about what happened. Because how do you explain that your enemy saved you? How do you explain that the moment you feared most, being vulnerable in front of men, turned into a moment that preserved your life? Many American nurses and corpsmen who served in these hospitals later admitted something too. Those women reminded us that the enemy also bleeds. The enemy also fears. The enemy is also human. This encounter, brief and unexpected, changed both sides. For the American medics, it shattered stereotypes. For the Japanese officers, it shattered years of indoctrination. And for history, it left behind one of the most unusual, least discussed, but profoundly human chapters of the Pacific War. In every war, there are battles fought with guns, but there are also battles fought with fear, dignity, and empathy. This story didn't end with victory or defeat. It ended with something far rarer, recognition of shared humanity in the unlikeliest moment. If you want more rare, untold World War II stories, the ones buried beneath the usual headlines, make sure to subscribe, like, and let me know in the comments. Should I cover more stories about medical encounters between enemies? Your support helps keep this historical storytelling alive.